I was thinking this morning about the Higgs Boson. I don't really know that much about particle physics, but I've read bits about it. And about how it became known as the God particle. There was a book written called The God Particle by the guy who used to run Fermilab. I think he's called Leon Lederman, something like that. I've never read the God Particle book, but I think it's quite interesting. I know there's a lot of flack. He came in with a lot of flack as a result of that book, and reputable physicists don't like the term the God particle, because they feel it brings in a metaphor which is unhelpful at the moment. And I think what Lederman and a chap called Overby wrote in New York Times, I think, he was talking about how the history of science and physics has been quite happy to use religious metaphors of God. Einstein particularly used a lot of metaphors of God. But recently, because of the rise of certain kinds of evangelical Christianity particularly, but other religious forces as well, and the kind of mobilization of science within those communities, it's become quite difficult to use religious metaphors in science without apparently giving support to entirely religious notions which are fundamentally non-scientific or possibly even anti-scientific. So the God particle gets flack for that reason. It seems to be supporting an anti-scientific agenda. But my point of purchase are not so much on that debate. It's not one I'm terribly interested in right now. But I am quite interested in why the Higgs boson becomes called the God particle, or why that feels interesting, why there's something poetically attractive about that idea. So when we talk about God and physics, it seems to me that it appears in three places. It appears most recently in the way I've just talked about, in terms of some kind of fundamental particle. It also appears at the other end of the spectrum in terms of something extraordinarily large, perhaps the universe itself. Certainly it's a common feature of kind of astrophysics language. And it sometimes appears, not something I'm going to talk about today, but sometimes it appears in relation to things like the mystery of causality, as it might be termed. I think Hume originally actually talked about cause being like the big question, what the nature of cause was and causality. And I think God features within that narrative quite a bit. Sometimes as cause and sometimes as purpose, which is kind of final cause. But the bits that I'm interested in is the big and the small, really, as part of that, and how it is that apparently completely opposing, completely diametrically opposite metaphors, one indicating the very small, like the Higgs boson, and one indicating the very large, can both stand in for the same mythical idea, stand in for the idea of God. I'm not sure if I can get to it in this video, but what I'm thinking of in terms of is how those ideas, kind of what the relationships between those ideas are, and perhaps some other things. When I've talked about these things in the past, I've been talking about the very large as being a kind of coterminous with ideas to do with upness, being in the sky. We think of the sky as being very large. And when things rise, we think of them coming together and becoming something very large. In the syntax of cognitive linguistics, it's talked about in terms of more is up. It's usually capitalized as more is up, because we have this kind of what's called a conflation, where an increase in the quantity of something tends to increase the vertical elevation of something. So if you pile sticks, for example, they get higher. So there's this thing to do with more is up. And so I do think we have this cognitively poetic connection between upness and moreness. And also, as I've said, convergence. So that tends to be part of, I can kind of see how those things go together and start to make sense for an understanding of something we might call God. If you want to have a God, it makes sense that it should be a really big one. and it should be up in the sky where the best stuff is, and where the best visibility is, and where the light is. I can kind of see that. Makes sense. But then there's this weird opposite to that, where God is the smallest. I'm not sure if the Higgs particle is the smallest thing, but for the sake of argument, let's say it is. God isn't this huge, complex thing. It's this small, infinitely simple thing. I know there is a history of the idea of God being something infinitely simple, and I like the idea, and that, I think, is playing into it. This idea that there might be some kind of fundamental, truly atomic, truly uncuttable entity, which is as simple as you can get. And so coming out of kind of Neoplatonic ideas of God, there seems to be some kind of relationship between that and this idea of an indivisible particle. Also to do with downness, which is the opposite of the thing I was talking about a minute ago. Downness tends to be where things fall apart. Things fall apart. The direction of dissemination is downwards, as opposed to convergence being upwards. So, training one's microscope, if you like, even if it's a huge LHC microscope, training one's microscope downwards towards the infinitely small is a kind of dissecting process, a kind of prizing apart, a separation, a distillation, an excision, to kind of cut through the illusionary detritus and the appearance to get down to the most fundamental, the most simple. So I think it's kind of playing into that, this idea of the most simple and the most basic, and the Platonic idea of what God might be, which is an aspect of downness. I think there's also something to do with this, and this is an idea I'd like to pursue, but I don't think I can find it here. This idea that that downness and the journey towards the infinitely small, and upness and the journey towards the infinitely large, have some kind of co-terminal point. It doesn't make any sense in physics, or any sense other than in a kind of mystical way. It has a kind of Ouroboros logic to it. There's a kind of that symbol of the Ouroboros, in which the serpent is consuming its own tail. That has that sense that if you go down far enough, you end up at the large. And I think in a previous video I mentioned the fantastic closing scene of the film The Incredible Shrinking Man, where this man, having shrunk not exactly to the size of a Higgs Boson, but to the size of an ant, I guess, has this epiphanic moment where he realizes, or claims to realize, that the infinitely small and the infinitely large are essentially the same thing. And I think you also see that played out in things like the Blake poem about seeing the universe in a grain of sand and eternity in an hour. Again, you have this idea, which is attractive. Now, I don't know how that works in relation to the Higgs boson, but there's a kind of a feeling that if you look down at the Higgs boson, you don't see nothing, you see everything. I mean, that's, it is a point where nothing becomes everything. At least that's, not really, but I think that's how the myth is playing itself out to a certain extent in that. At least I think so, at least for me it is. One related point, and I definitely can't really get to this, is to do with mysticism and the path of the mystic. And I think there's a writer called Stace who writes about mysticism, and he talks about, and shamanic practice really, and he talks about that there are two general approaches to mysticism. And he's borrowing from Jung here. And he says that there's a kind of extrovertive path to mysticism where you go out, and going out is kind of synonymous with also going up. And then there's the introspective path to mysticism when you go in and you go down. And you can kind of see that in various mystical and religious and meditative and contemplative practices. Some of them favour a kind of journey outwards, and some of them favour a journey inwards. Some of them look at the world, some of them look at psychology, broadly speaking. And the idea again being that whilst the paths of those different mystical traditions might be different, the end point is the same. The infinitely large meets the infinitesimally small, and they're the same. Again, as I say, it doesn't make any sense. I'm not claiming any kind of scientific legitimacy for these things, only that they seem to be drawing on some kind of parallel mythological structures. So the quest for the Higgs boson, the quest for the God particle, I think kind of makes sense, even though it seems to be opposed to a quest for the God which is everything and everywhere. Because on some strange poetic level, everything and everywhere is the same as exactly here.